They never told us why the 47th Company stopped transmitting. I learned the answer myself, in the end, though I wished to the God Emperor that I had remained ignorant. Some knowledge costs more than the learning of it is worth, and the truth about standing ground against the unstoppable is one such terrible education. My name is Corporal Marcus Webb, and I am recording this testimony not because I expect anyone to read it, but because the alternative is screaming, and I have done enough screaming to last several lifetimes. The med-servitors tell me my vocal cords have been damaged. They do not tell me by what. I already know. We arrived on Kalos IV as the 389th Kelleran Rifles, 8,000 men and women strong, fresh from our founding world, with the smell of home still clinging to our kit and the naive belief that we understood what war meant. Our commanders said we were being deployed to support a holding action. A minor incursion, they called it. Something had emerged from the northern wastes and was pressing against the defensive line that protected the planet's primary hive city. Standard deployment, standard engagement, standard victory for the Emperor's finest. I remember Bradley Patterson laughing at the briefing, nudging me with his elbow as the hololithic display showed the estimated enemy strength. "Looks like we'll be home for Founding Day," he said. Patterson was from a farming community 3 days' travel from my own hab block. We had trained together, suffered together through the brutal conditioning that turns soft civilians into something approximating soldiers. He had a gap between his front teeth that made his smile look perpetually surprised, and he kept a small pressed flower in his helmet liner that his sister had given him before we shipped out. I want you to remember what he looked like before I tell you what he became. The trenches were already dug when we arrived, a network of earthworks and ferrocrete bunkers that stretched across the ash-gray plains like surgical scars on diseased flesh. The men of the 47th had built them, we were told, before they were reassigned to another sector. I found that strange even then. Trenches are personal things. Soldiers do not abandon positions they have bled to create. But we were new, and we did not ask the questions that veterans would have known to ask. We simply occupied the bunkers, cleaned the latrines that still smelled of the previous occupants, and waited for whatever was coming from the north. I remember the sound most clearly from those first days. Not the wind, though the wind on Kalos IV carries a keening pitch that works its way into your skull and nests there like a parasite. No, it was the silence beneath the wind. The complete absence of fauna, of insects, of any living thing except us, and the scraggly vegetation that clung to existence in the shadows of our fortifications. The 47th had written things on the bunker walls. Most were the usual soldiers' graffiti, crude jokes, and cruder anatomical suggestions. But in one corner, someone had scratched a single phrase over and over until the ferrocrete was grooved with it. "It does not stop." I showed it to Patterson, and he laughed, though his laugh had lost some of its certainty. "Propaganda," he said, trying to spook the replacements. We scraped the words away and painted the Emperor's Aquila over them instead. It made us feel better for exactly 3 days. The first attack came on our 4th night in position. I say attack, because that is the word our training taught us to use, but it suggests something that can be understood in human terms. Something with tactics and objectives, and the possibility of failure. What came at us from the darkness had none of these qualities. We heard them before we saw them, a sound like grinding stone mixed with the wet tearing of meat, and then the searchlights found them, and I understood for the first time that there are things in the galaxy that the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer does not prepare you for. They were Xenos, I think, though Xenos is a broad category that encompasses everything from greenskins to the elegant predators of the webway. These were something else, something that looked as though it had been designed by a mind that hated the very concept of individual existence. They moved like a tide, thousands upon thousands of them, each one bristling with biological weapons that gleamed wetly in the searchlight beams. They made no war cries, spoke no demands. They simply came, and where they passed, nothing remained. We fired until our last packs were depleted, and then we fired again with whatever we could scrounge. The heavy weapons crews burned through their ammunition in the first hour, and still they came. I saw Sergeant Major Hendricks that night for the first time, striding along the trench line as calm as if he were inspecting a parade ground, his voice cutting through the chaos, with orders that somehow made sense of the insensible, controlled bursts. He called, "Aim for the central mass. They die like anything else." It was a lie, of course. I would learn later how much of what Hendricks told us was lies, and how necessary those lies were to keep us functioning. But in that moment, his certainty was an anchor in a sea of madness, and we clung to it with the desperation of drowning men. The attack lasted until dawn, and then the creatures withdrew as suddenly as they had come, melting back into the ashen wastes as the sun crept over the horizon. We had held. That was what the officers told us, their voices carrying the forced brightness of men who were trying to convince themselves as much as us. We had held, and we would continue to hold, and the Emperor protects. I walked the trench line after the battle, counting the dead and trying not to look too closely at the wounded. Patterson found me near the eastern bunker, his face the color of old bone, and his hands shaking so badly he could barely light his low stick. "Marcus," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. "Marcus, they just kept coming. They just kept coming, and they didn't stop." I put my hand on his shoulder and said something reassuring, something about duty and faith and the inevitability of Imperial victory. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, and I think we both knew they were hollow. But sometimes hollow words are all we have, and we hold on to them the way a drowning man holds on to flotsam. The second night was worse. The third was worse still. By the end of our first week in the trenches, we had lost 1,500 men, and the med stations were overflowing with casualties that the surgeons could not save. I stopped counting the dead after the fourth day. It seemed obscene to reduce them to numbers, and besides, the numbers were too large to comprehend. Instead, I began tracking something else, the changes in Hendricks. The sergeant major had been a reassuring presence in those first days, his calm voice and steady hands a counterweight to the madness that surrounded us. But as the week wore on, I noticed that his calm was becoming something else, something that looked less like discipline and more like absence. He would stand at the trench lip during attacks, fully exposed to the enemy fire, and he would not flinch. Not from bravery, I came to understand, but from something that had moved beyond bravery into a territory I could not name. I asked Lieutenant Kowalski about it once, in the brief lull between the morning's attack and the evening's preparation. Kowalski was a thin, nervous man who had been promoted beyond his capabilities and knew it. He looked at me with eyes that held far too much knowledge and said simply, "Hendricks has been here before." I waited for him to elaborate, but he turned away and busied himself with ammunition counts. It was not until much later that I understood what he meant. The sound became my constant companion during those weeks. That grinding, tearing, advancing sound that heralded each attack, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I heard it in my sleep, in my waking moments, in the silence between heartbeats. It worked its way into my skull the way the wind did, and it nested there alongside the memories of things I had seen that no human should see. I began to notice that the sound was changing, or perhaps that I was becoming better at hearing it. There were layers to it now, harmonics that I could pick out individually, the wet tearing of biology repurposing itself, the grinding of chitin against stone, and beneath it all, something else. Something that might have been communication, if communication could exist without language or thought. Patterson noticed the changes in me before I noticed them myself. "You're listening," he said one evening, as I sat at the trench lip with my head cocked toward the northern wastes. "You're listening like you expect them to answer." I started to deny it, but the words died in my throat. He was right. I was listening for something, some pattern in the chaos that would let me understand what we were facing. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I thought I could almost hear it. A rhythm, a purpose, a hunger that was vast beyond comprehension and patient beyond measure. The 47th Company, I thought. They heard it too. That was why they stopped transmitting. Hendricks called a briefing on the 15th day, gathering what remained of the company officers in the command bunker. I was there as a runner, pressed against the ferrocrete wall with the other non-commissioned personnel, watching as the sergeant major spread a tactical map across the table. The map showed our position, the defensive line, the estimated enemy concentration in the northern wastes. It also showed something I had not seen before, a secondary position, 20 kilometers to our rear, marked with symbols that I did not recognize. "Command has made a decision," Hendricks said, and his voice was that terrible calm that I had come to associate with news that would break something inside us. "We are being reclassified as a delaying action. Our objective is no longer to hold the line. Our objective is to buy time." Lieutenant Kowalski made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "Buy time for what?" Hendricks turned to look at him, and I saw something in the sergeant major's eyes that I had never seen before. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. Something that had moved through fear and come out the other side into a country where such emotions no longer had meaning. "For the evacuation of the Hive City," Hendricks said. "For the relocation of strategic assets, for whatever they deem worth saving." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "We are not meant to survive this engagement. We are meant to make our deaths expensive." The news spread through the trenches like plague, and in its wake came the chaos that always follows the death of hope. Some men deserted, fleeing into the wastes with whatever supplies they could carry. The creatures found them within hours, and we heard their screams carried back to us on that keening wind. Others turned their weapons on themselves, choosing a quick death over the slow one that awaited us. I found Patterson in the eastern bunker after the briefing, staring at the wall where we had painted the Aquila over those scratched words. "It does not stop," he said, and his voice was flat and far away. "They knew. The 47th knew. They tried to tell us." I sat down beside him, and we passed his low stick back and forth in silence. There was nothing to say. We were dead men, all of us. The only question was how long we could stretch out our dying. It was Patterson who finally spoke, his voice stronger now, touched with something that might have been resolve. "If we're buying time," he said, "then let's make them pay full price. Let's make them remember the Kellerun rifles." I looked at him, at that gap-toothed smile that still held a shadow of the farm boy he had been, and I felt something kindle in my chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope had died with Hendricks' briefing, but something like its ghost. Something that said, if we could not live, we could at least choose how to die. The next 3 weeks were a blur of blood and fire and that endless, grinding sound. We threw ourselves into the defense with a ferocity born of desperation, and for a time it seemed to make a difference. The creatures still came, still surged against our walls in their mindless, hungry tide. But we met them with everything we had, and sometimes, just sometimes, we pushed them back. Hendricks led every counterattack personally, his bolt pistol barking and his power sword carving arcs of light through the chitinous masses. He seemed to have made peace with something in himself, or perhaps he had simply stopped being the man we had known and become something else, something that existed only for this moment, this purpose. I fought beside Patterson in the eastern sector, and together we became something more than we had been. The bond between soldiers in combat is difficult to explain to those who have not experienced it. It is a connection that transcends friendship, that makes two people into a single organism with a single purpose. We watched each other's flanks, anticipated each other's movements, breathed as one when the fighting was at its worst, and slowly, terribly, I began to notice the changes in us both. It started with the hearing. The sound that I had been tracking, that grinding, tearing, advancing symphony of the enemy, began to resolve into something more coherent. I could hear individual creatures now, could track their movements by the subtle variations in their biological noise. Patterson noticed it too. "It's like they're talking," he whispered one night, as we huddled in a shell crater waiting for the next wave. Like they're telling each other where we are. He was right. They were communicating, after a fashion. And somehow, impossibly, I was beginning to understand them. Not their words, if they had words, but their intent, their hunger, their vast, incomprehensible purpose that reduced individual existence to nothing more than fuel for something greater. I should have reported it. I should have gone to Hendricks or the commissar and told them what was happening to me. But I was afraid, not of what they would do, but of what it meant. If I could hear them, could understand them, then what did that make me? And if I reported it, what would happen to Patterson, who was clearly experiencing the same changes? The breakthrough came on the 32nd day. Not a tactical breakthrough, nothing so clean and military as that. A breakthrough in my understanding of what we were facing. I was on watch in the northern observation post when I heard it clearly for the first time. Not the grinding, not the tearing, but the voice beneath it all, the collective consciousness of the swarm, speaking in a language that was not language, thinking in a way that was not thought. And what it said, what it conveyed in that moment of terrible clarity, was this: we were not enemies, we were not obstacles, we were not even food, though food was part of it. We were raw material, we were potential, we were the components from which something greater would be built. The 47th Company had not been destroyed. The 47th Company had been absorbed, their bodies and minds broken down and repurposed into new forms that served the swarm's infinite hunger. And we, the 389th Kelleran Rifles, were destined for the same fate. Not death. Something worse than death. Integration. I found Hendricks in the command bunker that night, alone, staring at the tactical map with eyes that saw nothing on its surface. I told him what I had heard, what I had understood, and I watched his face for some reaction. There was none. He simply nodded, as if I had confirmed something he had long suspected. The 47th were my men, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man reciting a prayer he no longer believed. I commanded them. I led them to this place. I watched them fight and die and become something else. He turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes had changed. There was something moving behind them, something that did not belong to the man I had known. Do you want to know the truth, Corporal Webb? The truth about what we're fighting? The truth about what happens when the Guard faces something that cannot be stopped? I nodded, though every instinct screamed at me to run. Hendricks smiled, and his smile was terrible. We become part of it. We always become part of it. That is the price of standing ground. The transformation is not defeat. It is the only victory available to us. He told me everything. The secondary position on the map was not an evacuation point. It was a processing facility, one of dozens scattered across the Imperium's eastern frontier, where the survivors of engagements like ours were taken and studied, not for medical treatment, for research into the assimilation process, for understanding how the enemy absorbed its victims, and for identifying those who had been touched but not yet transformed, so that they could be pressed into service as interpreters, scouts, infiltrators in the endless war against the swarm. Hendricks himself had been one of them once, a survivor of a battle much like this one, who had been pulled from the wreckage of his company and given a choice: die as a man or live as something between. He had chosen to live, and for the past decade he had served as a guide for other units facing the same enemy, leading them through the initial shock, the gradual understanding, the final transformation that awaited those who survived long enough to be useful. You hear them, he said, and it was not a question. You understand them. That means you're already changing, Corporal. The only question is how far you're willing to go. I should have shot him. I know that now. The man standing before me was no longer a servant of the Emperor, was perhaps no longer a man at all. But I could not pull the trigger, partly because I was not sure the bolt would kill him, and partly because I understood, with terrible clarity, that he was telling the truth. The choice he offered was not a false one. It was the only choice that had ever been available to us. Die fighting, and be absorbed into the swarm as raw biomass, or survive, transformed, and serve the Imperium in a different capacity. It was not a good choice. It was not even a human choice, but it was the only one we had. I left the bunker without giving Hendricks an answer. I needed to think. I needed to talk to Patterson. I needed to understand what was happening to me, and whether there was any way to stop it. But as I made my way through the trenches, I realized that I already knew the answer. The sound was inside me now, woven into the fabric of my thoughts. I could feel the swarm pressing against my consciousness, testing my defenses, looking for a way in. And the worst part, the part that I could not admit even to myself, was that part of me wanted to let them in. Patterson was waiting for me in the eastern bunker, his hands pressed against the walls, his head cocked at that listening angle that I had come to recognize. "I can hear them," he said when I entered. "I can hear them thinking, Marcus. I can feel what they feel." His voice was dreamy, distant, and when he turned to look at me, I saw that his eyes had changed too, the same thing moving behind them that I had seen in Hendricks, the same terrible knowledge. "They're not evil," he said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "They're not cruel. They're just hungry. They just want to grow, to become more, to incorporate everything they touch into something larger." It's not so different from the Imperium. When you think about it, the Imperium absorbs worlds, absorbs peoples, breaks them down, and rebuilds them in its image. The only difference is that the swarm is honest about what it does. I wanted to argue. I wanted to shake him, to remind him of the flower in his helmet liner, of the sister who was waiting for him back home. But I could not find the words. Because he was right, at least partially. The methods were different, but the result was the same. Absorption, integration, the individual crushed beneath the weight of something larger. "What do we do?" I asked, and my voice was a stranger's voice, hollow and far away. Patterson smiled, and his smile was full of teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "We fight," he said. "We fight until we can't fight anymore. And then we become something else. That's what soldiers do, Marcus. We become what we need to become to survive." The final assault began 3 days later, and it was unlike anything we had faced before. The creatures came not in waves but in a single, overwhelming tide, their bodies packed so tightly that they formed a living wall that stretched from horizon to horizon. The sound was deafening. That grinding, tearing, hungry symphony magnified 1,000-fold, and beneath it, I could hear the voice of the swarm speaking directly into my mind. It was offering me something, a place, a purpose, a role in the greater organism that had no beginning and no end. It promised me that the fear would stop, that the loneliness would end, that I would never again have to carry the weight of individual consciousness. It promised me peace, and I wanted to accept. Emperor, forgive me. I wanted to accept. But I thought of the Aquila we had painted over those scratched words, the symbol of the Imperium that had given us everything and asked only our deaths in return. I thought of the men and women who had stood beside me in those trenches, who had fought and died for something they believed in, even if that something was a lie. And I raised my weapon and fired into the advancing mass, screaming my defiance into the void. The battle lasted 3 hours, and when it was over, there were fewer than 200 of us left alive. Hendricks was among the survivors, though he had taken wounds that should have killed any normal man. Patterson was there too, his uniform soaked in blood that was not his own, his eyes reflecting a light that came from somewhere beyond the burning fortifications. The creatures had withdrawn again, but not in defeat. In satisfaction, they had tested us, measured us, determined which of us were worth absorbing and which were merely biomass to be processed. The survivors were being separated from the dead with clinical efficiency, loaded onto transports that had appeared from nowhere, bound for the secondary position that was not an evacuation point. I understood now what that meant. I understood what waited for us, and I understood that there was no escaping it. The choice Hendricks had offered me was the same choice that every survivor of these engagements faced. The choice between two different kinds of death. I looked at Patterson as the transports lifted off, and I saw that he was smiling. Not the gap-toothed smile of the farm boy I had known, but something else. Something that had moved beyond human expression into territory I could not map. "We survived," he said, and his voice was layered now, harmonic, touched with frequencies that human vocal cords should not be able to produce. "We get to become something more." I wanted to weep. I wanted to rage, but I could only sit in silence as the transport carried us away from the battlefield, away from the dead, toward whatever waited at the journey's end. The facility was nothing like I had expected. I had imagined something from the horror stories, a dungeon of blood and screaming, a place where imperial science tortured its subjects in the name of understanding. The reality was almost worse. It was clean, efficient, humane. If that word could be applied to what they did there. The medics who examined us were gentle, professional, concerned only with our physical and mental health. The quarters they assigned us were comfortable, even luxurious by Guard standards, and the tests they conducted were painless, almost casual, as if they were simply cataloguing the changes that had already begun rather than inflicting new ones. Hendricks disappeared into the administrative levels on the first day, and I did not see him again. Patterson was assigned to a different wing, one reserved for subjects whose transformation had progressed further than mine. I caught glimpses of him sometimes, through observation windows or in the cafeteria, and each time I saw him, he looked less like the man I had known. His features were blurring, smoothing, becoming something generic and perfect. His eyes had lost their individual color, become something iridescent that shifted in the light. And his smile, when he smiled, was full of that terrible peace that the swarm had promised me. The peace of surrender, the peace of absorption, the peace of ceasing to exist as a separate being. I was assigned to the interpreter program. As Hendricks had predicted, my ability to hear the swarm, to understand its communications, made me valuable in ways that pure soldiers were not. They trained me to translate, to predict, to guide other units through the initial stages of engagement. They taught me how to recognize the signs of transformation in others, how to identify which survivors could be salvaged and which had already been lost. And slowly, inevitably, they taught me to accept what I was becoming. The process was gradual, almost gentle. Each day, I heard the swarm more clearly. Each day, I understood more of its vast, incomprehensible purpose. Each day, the individual called Marcus Webb grew smaller, less significant, more willing to be subsumed into something larger. I fought it at first. I clung to my memories, my identity, my belief in the Emperor and the Imperium. But the swarm was patient. It had all the time in the universe. And eventually, I stopped fighting. I saw Patterson for the last time on the 47th day of my processing. He was in one of the transformation chambers, suspended in a web of biological material that pulsed with the rhythm of the swarm. His body was no longer recognizable as human. It had been reshaped, repurposed, turned into something that served the greater organism. But his eyes were still there, somewhere in the mass of transformed flesh, and when I looked into them, I saw a flicker of recognition, a ghost of the farm boy who had kept a flower in his helmet liner. A farewell. I should have felt grief. I should have felt horror. But all I felt was a strange kind of peace. Patterson had become something more, something beyond the limitations of individual existence. He was part of the swarm now, part of its vast consciousness, part of something that would endure long after the Imperium itself had crumbled into dust. And soon, I would join him. That was what happened when the Guard faced the unstoppable. That was the truth that the 47th Company had learned, that the 389th had learned, that every unit sacrificed against this enemy eventually learned. You could not defeat it. You could not outlast it. You could only become part of it, and hope that some fragment of what you had been survived the integration. I am recording this testimony in the final hours before my own transformation begins. The medics have been kind enough to give me this time. to let me set down in words what I have experienced and understood. They tell me it is part of the process, that many subjects find peace in leaving some record of their individual existence before that existence ends. I do not know if anyone will ever hear these words. I do not know if they will matter, but I want someone, somewhere, to understand what we faced on Kalos IV. Not the tactical details, not the strategic implications, but the human cost. The price paid by 8,000 men and women who thought they were fighting for the Emperor and discovered they were fighting for their own dissolution. Hendricks came to see me this morning, for the first time since we arrived at the facility. He looked different now, his features smooth and ageless, his eyes holding that same iridescent quality I had seen in Patterson. He told me that I had performed well, that my contributions to the interpreter program would save lives in the conflicts to come. He told me that the transformation was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new existence that would make my time as an individual seem like a fevered dream. He told me to be proud. I do not know if I am proud. I do not know if I am anything anymore. The boundaries of myself have grown thin, permeable, and I can feel the swarm pressing against them, waiting to rush in and fill the spaces where Marcus Webb used to be. Soon there will be no Marcus Webb, only a component, a node, a fragment of something vast and hungry and eternal. But before I go, I want to say this. We held the line. For 32 days, we stood against something that could not be stopped, and we made them pay for every meter of ground they took. We were not heroes. We were not special. We were just soldiers, doing what soldiers have always done, dying for a cause they did not fully understand. And in the end, that is all any of us can do. Stand ground, hold the line, make the enemy pay full price for victory. And when the end comes, as it always comes, face it with whatever courage remains. The Emperor protects, they told us. The Emperor provides. I believed that once. I do not know what I believe now. But I know this. The men and women of the 389th Kelleran Rifles faced an unstoppable force, and they did not break. They bent. They were absorbed. They became something else. But they did not break. Let that be their epitaph. Let that be mine. The sound is very loud now, and my fingers are having difficulty forming words. The transformation is beginning, earlier than they predicted. Perhaps my contributions have accelerated the process. Perhaps I was always destined for this. I can feel Patterson somewhere in the vast consciousness that is opening before me. I can feel Hendricks, and the 47th, and all the others who came before. They are waiting for me. They are welcoming me. And somewhere, in the depths of that infinite communion, I think I can hear the grinding, tearing, advancing sound that has haunted me since Kalos IV. Only now it does not sound like horror. It sounds like home. This is Corporal Marcus Webb, 389th Kelleran Rifles, recording his final testimony. I was a soldier of the Imperium. I was a man. I was afraid. Now I am becoming something else. Something larger. Something eternal. The swarm is patient. The swarm is hungry. The swarm is forever. And soon, so will I be. They ask me what happens when the Guard faces an unstoppable force. I can tell them now. I can tell them with the clarity of one who has lived it, who is living it, who will continue to live it long after the individual called Marcus Webb has ceased to exist. What happens is this. We become part of the force. We become part of the unstoppable. We become the thing we could not defeat, and in becoming it, we achieve a kind of victory that no battle could ever provide. The victory of surrender, the victory of absorption, the victory of peace. I am not afraid anymore. I do not think I am anything anymore. But before the last of me dissolves into the greater whole, I want to say, remember us. Remember the Kelleran Rifles. Remember what we faced and what we became. And if you ever find yourself standing ground against something that cannot be stopped, know this. There is no shame in becoming. There is no defeat in transformation. There is only the endless cycle of absorption and renewal, the eternal hunger of something vast beyond comprehension. That is what happens when the Guard faces the unstoppable. That is the only truth that matters. I am going now. The sound is calling me. The swarm is waiting. And somewhere in its depths, Patterson is smiling with that gap-toothed smile, welcoming me home. Goodbye. Remember us. And Emperor, protect those who come after, because in the end, even he cannot save you from becoming what you must become to survive. The line is broken. The defense is over. The transformation is complete, and what remains of Marcus Webb is going home at last.